There's a special kind of pain that comes from being rejected by your own blood. It's the kind that doesn't fade with time. It just settles deeper into your bones. Corinne Alder knew that pain well. At 58, she'd spent decades as the family disappointment, the daughter who'd walked away and was never forgiven. When her father died, she wasn't left the farm or any treasured heirlooms. She got a frozen, collapsing cabin in the mountains that nobody else wanted. Most people would have walked away from it, but Corinne saw something else. A chance to rebuild more than just rotting wood and broken windows. What happens when the woman everyone gave up on refuses to stay down? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and regret. Corinne sat in a worn leather chair, her calloused hands folded in her lap. Watching as the attorney, a thin man named Parsons, who'd known her father for 40 years, shuffled through documents with the careful movements of someone delivering bad news gently. Across the room, her brother Vincent sat with his arms crossed, his jaw set in that familiar expression of disapproval she remembered from childhood. He was 62 now, his face weathered from decades of farm work, his hair gone mostly grey. Next to him, Judith, 60 years old and still carrying herself with the rigid posture their mother had drilled into all of them, stared at the wall, refusing to meet Corinne's eyes. It had been 35 years since she'd been in the same room with both of them. 35 years since she'd walked away from the Alder family farm at 23, choosing a life her family couldn't understand over the expectations they'd built around her like a cage. The estate is straightforward, Parsons was saying, his voice measured and professional. The farm and all its assets, the house, barns, equipment, and 200 acres, are to be divided equally between Vincent Alder and Judith Alder, as per your father's wishes. Corinne had expected that. She'd made her peace with it years ago, or so she'd told herself. The farm had always been Vincent's destiny, and Judith had never left, had married a local man and raised her children within sight of the fields where they'd all grown up. Corinne was the one who'd broken the pattern, who'd chosen differently. However, Parsons continued, looking directly at Corinne now, there is a separate bequest for Corinne Alder. Vincent shifted in his chair. Judith's eyes finally moved, landing on Corinne with something that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell after so many years of silence. Parsons slid a document across his desk. Your father left you the cabin property on Blacktail Ridge, 40 acres of mountain land, including the structure and all contents therein. Corinne stared at the paper. She remembered the cabin vaguely. A hunting shelter her father had built decades ago, miles from any road, accessible only by a rough track that washed out every spring. She'd been there once as a child, maybe twice. It had been primitive even then, just 4 walls and a roof to keep out the worst of the weather. That old wreck? Vincent's voice cut through the quiet office. It's been falling apart for 20 years. There's nothing up there worth having. Nevertheless, Parsons said, his tone carefully neutral, it's been left to Miss Alder, along with a small sum for property taxes and maintenance. Judith made a sound that might have been a laugh. How appropriate. The daughter who wanted nothing to do with the real work gets a collapsed shack in the middle of nowhere. The words stung, but Corinne kept her face still. She'd learned a long time ago not to show hurt to people who'd use it against her. Instead, she reached for the document, scanning the legal language until she found the property description. 40 acres, a cabin, a dirt road that probably didn't exist anymore. It felt like exactly what it was, a message from beyond the grave. This is what you're worth to us. This is all you deserve. I'll need your signature here, Parsons said, indicating several places on the form. And there's one more thing. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small cloth bag, setting it gently on the desk in front of Corinne. Your father wanted you to have this as well. Corinne untied the bag with trembling fingers. Inside was a pocket watch, old and heavy, its silver case worn smooth by decades of handling. She recognized it immediately. Her father had carried it every day of his life, pulled it from his vest pocket to check the time with the same ritual gesture morning and night. She opened the case. The watch had stopped at 3:47 in the afternoon. The exact time she'd driven away from the farm 35 years ago. Her car packed with everything she owned. Her father standing silent and stone-faced in the driveway, while her mother, still alive then, wept on the porch. "He never wound it again," Parsons said quietly. After that day, the office went very still. Even Vincent and Judith seemed to feel the weight of that revelation, the confession contained in a stopped watch. Their father, the man who'd been too proud and too rigid to bend, too hurt to forgive, had marked the moment his daughter left and carried it with him every day until his death. Corinne closed the watch with a soft click and stood. "Thank you, Mr. Parsons. I'll sign whatever needs signing." She completed the paperwork in silence, aware of her siblings watching her, aware of the questions they weren't asking and the accusations they weren't voicing. When it was done, she tucked the watch into her jacket pocket and walked out of the office without looking back. Her truck was parked on the street outside, a 15-year-old Ford with a rusted bed and an engine that burned oil. She sat behind the wheel for a long moment, her hands shaking now that no one could see. The life she'd built since leaving the farm had been quiet and solitary. She'd married once, briefly, to the musician she'd run away with, a man named Tommy who'd played guitar in bars and dreamed of Nashville. The marriage had lasted 3 years before they'd both admitted what had been obvious from the start. They'd fallen in love with the idea of escape, not with each other. There had been no children, no career to speak of. She'd worked a long string of jobs, waitress, house cleaner, factory worker, retail clerk, moving from town to town whenever staying in one place started to feel too much like settling. For the past 5 years, she'd been in Ridgeline, a small mountain town 3 hours from the farm, working part-time at Brennan's Hardware and living in a rented room above a garage. It was a small life, but it was hers. No one told her what to think or how to be. No one looked at her with disappointment in their eyes. But now, sitting in her truck with her father's stopped watch in her pocket, Corinne felt the weight of all those years pressing down on her. 35 years of proving her independence. 35 years of telling herself she didn't need them, didn't miss them, was better off alone. 35 years, and her father had never wound his watch. She started the engine and drove back to Ridgeline, but she couldn't settle that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, turning the watch over and over in her hands. The metal was warm from being held, worn smooth in places where her father's thumb had rubbed against it year after year. In the morning, she called in sick to work and drove north into the mountains. The road to Blacktail Ridge was worse than she'd imagined. What had once been a logging track was now barely passable, washed out in places, overgrown with brush that scraped the sides of her truck. She had to stop twice to clear fallen branches, and once to stack rocks in a washed-out section just to get enough traction to pass. When she finally reached the cabin, she sat in the truck for a full minute, just staring. Vincent had been right. It was a wreck. The porch had collapsed entirely on one side. The steps leading up to it had rotted through, and several windows were broken, their frames hanging at odd angles. The roof sagged in the middle, and she could see daylight through gaps in the walls where the chinking had fallen out. Snow was piled against the north side of the structure, still unmelted even though it was late April, and the whole thing leaned slightly to the left, as if one good wind would knock it over entirely. But it was hers. Corinne got out of the truck and walked closer, testing each step carefully. The door was locked, but the key was on the ring Parsons had given her. Inside, the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft, a cast-iron stove, and not much else. Everything was covered in dust and mouse droppings. The floorboards were soft with rot in places, and there was a strong smell of mold and decay. It was worse than worthless. It would cost more to repair than it could ever be worth. She should have walked away. Should have signed it over to Vincent and Judith, let them deal with it or let it fall down on its own. Should have gone back to Ridgeline and her quiet, solitary life and forgotten the whole thing. Instead, she went back to her truck, pulled out the sleeping bag she kept behind the seat, and spread it out on the cleanest section of floor. She built a fire in the stove, using dry wood she found stacked under a tarp behind the cabin, and sat watching the flames through the open door while the sun went down behind the mountains. In the silence of the evening, with nothing but the crackle of burning wood and the whisper of wind through the pines, something settled in Corinne's chest. Not peace exactly, but something close to it. A sense of space, of possibility. She pulled out the pocket watch and looked at it again in the firelight. 3:47, the moment everything broke. The moment time stopped for her father. But time hadn't stopped for her. She'd lived an entire life in those 35 years, made choices, learned skills, survived on her own terms. She'd left the farm, a girl who didn't know who she was, and she'd become a woman who could fix a car engine, patch a roof, frame a wall, wire a circuit. She'd become someone who didn't need anyone. Maybe that was the point. Maybe her father hadn't left her this broken cabin as an insult. Maybe he'd left it as a challenge, or an invitation, or an apology he couldn't figure out how to voice. She closed the watch and put it back in her pocket. In the morning, she would go back to Ridgeline, pack up her room, quit her job at the hardware store, and come back with tools and materials. She would rebuild this cabin piece by piece, beam by beam. She would prove that the woman they'd written off still had strength in her hands and fire in her chest. She would prove them all wrong. The first week was harder than Corinne had imagined. She'd spent 3 decades working with her hands, but there was a difference between fixing a leaky faucet in a rented room and rehabilitating a structure that was more whole than wall. Every morning she woke with new aches, new blisters, new doubts about whether she'd made a terrible mistake, but she kept working. She started with the basics, clearing debris, assessing damage, making lists of what needed to be done and in what order. The roof was the priority. Everything else was pointless if water kept pouring in. She spent 2 days on a ladder, pulling off rotted shingles and replacing them with new ones she'd bought in Ridgeline, her fingers numb from cold despite her work gloves. Next came the windows. She measured each opening, drove back to town for glass and framing materials, and spent 3 more days cutting, fitting, and sealing. Her back screamed at her every night, but each morning she got up and climbed back up that ladder. By the end of the week, she had a structure that was weatherproof at least. The cabin still looked rough, still needed everything from new floorboards to proper insulation, but it no longer felt like it was actively dying. On the 8th day, she turned her attention to the interior. The floorboards near the fireplace were the worst, soft and spongy with rot, dangerous to walk on. She started prying them up, working carefully to avoid breaking through entirely. That's when she found the letter. It was tucked in the space between the floor joists and the subfloor, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it mostly dry over the years. Corinne pulled it out carefully, her heart suddenly pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The envelope was addressed to her in her father's handwriting. No stamp, no postmark. It had never been mailed. The postmark date on the envelope was 20 years old. She sat down on the cleanest section of floor, her tools forgotten, and opened it with shaking hands. Corinne, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you'll ever come to this place, or if you'll even want what I'm leaving you. But I need to write it down, even if these words never reach you. You reminded me of my mother. I never told you that. Never told anyone. But every time I looked at you, I saw her face, the way she'd get that stubborn set to her jaw when she'd made up her mind about something. The way she'd look at the horizon, like she was searching for something we couldn't give her. She left us when I was 10, walked away and never came back. My father told everyone she died, but that was a lie. She just couldn't stand to stay anymore. I spent my whole childhood wondering what was wrong with us, what was wrong with me that made her leave. When you were growing up, I saw that same restlessness in you, that same searching look, and I was terrified. Terrified you'd leave just like she did. Terrified I'd lose you the same way I lost her. So I tried to make you stay. I was hard on you, too hard. I set rules that didn't make sense and expectations you could never meet. I thought if I could just control things, if I could just keep you close enough, you wouldn't disappear. But that's exactly what made you leave, isn't it? I stood in the driveway and watched you drive away, and I felt 10 years old again. I felt like that little boy whose mother walked out and never looked back. I was so angry. At you, at her, at myself. I stopped my watch at the moment you left because I wanted to mark it, wanted to remember it, wanted to punish myself for failing again. But here's what I've learned in the years since. You didn't leave because something was wrong with us. You left because something was right with you. You knew who you were, or at least who you needed to become, and you had the courage to go find out. I built this cabin 30 years ago as a hunting shelter, but I kept coming back to it over the years. It became a place I could come to think, to remember, to imagine conversations with you that I didn't know how to have in person. I've been fixing it up slowly, over time, adding to it, making it stronger. I've always thought of it as yours, even though you didn't know it existed. This is my apology, Corinne. My way of saying I understand now. You needed space to breathe, and I tried to suffocate you. You needed freedom, and I built you a cage. So here's what I'm giving you, a place of your own. A place where no one can tell you who to be. It's rough now, but it has good bones. You always were good with your hands, better than Vincent ever was, though I never told you that. If anyone can make something of this place, it's you. I hope you find whatever you're looking for. I hope you find peace. I hope someday you can forgive a stubborn old man who loved you more than he knew how to say. Your father, Corinne, read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, her chest tight with a grief so sharp it felt like drowning. All those years, all that silence, all that pain on both sides, and he'd understood. He'd understood, and he still couldn't say it, couldn't reach out, couldn't bridge the gap between them. But he'd tried, in his way, with his hands and his tools, and this half-finished cabin in the woods. He'd tried to build her a bridge home. She sat there until the light faded, the letter clutched in her hands, her mind reeling through decades of misunderstanding and missed chances. Her father had been haunted by his own mother's abandonment, had projected that terror onto her, had pushed her away while trying desperately to hold on, and she'd left, proving his fears correct. Never knowing she was reenacting his childhood trauma, 3 generations of leaving, 3 generations of not knowing how to love each other past the pain. The anger she'd carried for 35 years began to crack and shift, making room for something more complicated. Grief for what could have been. Understanding of what actually was, and underneath it all, a strange kind of gratitude. He'd given her this place, this space, this chance, not as a punishment, but as a gift, not as rejection, but as acceptance. She stood, her legs stiff from sitting so long on the hard floor, and looked around the cabin with new eyes. Every board her father had replaced, every window he'd installed, every improvement he'd made over the years. It had all been for her. He'd been building her a home she didn't know she had, preparing a place she could return to if she ever chose to come back. The work took on a different meaning after that. She wasn't rebuilding to prove them wrong anymore. She was rebuilding to honor what her father had started, to finish the conversation he'd tried to have through hammer and nails. That night, she read the letter again by lamplight, then carefully folded it and placed it in her jacket pocket next to the stopped watch. 2 artifacts of her father's love, both frozen in time, both finally understood. In the morning, she attacked the rotted floorboards with renewed purpose, pulling up the damaged sections and replacing them with new lumber. She worked through the day until her hands were raw, stopping only when darkness made it impossible to see. She'd thought coming here was about independence, about proving she didn't need them, didn't need anyone, but maybe it was about something else entirely. Maybe it was about learning that needing people and being your own person weren't opposites. Maybe it was about understanding that you could be strong on your own and still want to belong somewhere. Maybe it was about forgiveness, of her father, of her family, and finally of herself for leaving in the first place. She fell asleep that night with her father's words echoing in her mind. If anyone can make something of this place, it's you. She would. Not despite him, but because of him. 3 weeks became 4, then 5. The cabin slowly transformed under Corinne's hands. taking shape in ways that surprised even her. Each morning she woke with the sun, made coffee on the wood stove, and planned her day's work with the methodical approach she'd learned from years of making do with limited resources. The early June weather cooperated more days than not. The snow had melted completely from around the cabin, revealing a clearing that was larger than she'd remembered. Maybe an acre of relatively flat ground surrounded by towering pines and spruce. Wildflowers were starting to bloom in the meadow grass, and she could hear a creek running somewhere nearby, though she hadn't yet taken the time to explore and find it. She was working on reinforcing the support beams under the porch when she found the tool chest. It was tucked in the corner of the crawl space, covered with a tarp and years of accumulated dirt. When she dragged it out into the light and pried open the lid, she had to sit back on her heels, overwhelmed. Inside were woodworking tools, chisels, planes, saws, mallets, all hand-carved and maintained with obvious care. Each handle bore her father's initials burned into the wood, J.A. for James Alder, and next to the initials on each tool was a year dating back decades. The oldest was marked 1969, the newest 2003. He'd made these himself. Spent hours, probably, carving and shaping each handle to fit his grip, maintaining the metal, keeping everything sharp and ready. These weren't store-bought tools that anyone could own. These were personal, intimate objects that had been shaped by years of use. Corinne lifted out a chisel, testing its weight, running her thumb carefully along the edge. Still sharp. She could see the slight depression in the handle where her father's thumb had rested, the wood worn smooth by decades of pressure. She tried it out on a scrap of lumber, and the blade cut clean and true, shaving off a thin curl of wood that fell at her feet. The tool felt alive in her hand, like it remembered the work it was meant to do. From that day forward, she used her father's tools for everything. It felt right somehow, using what he'd made to finish what he'd started. Every time she picked up the mallet or the plane, she felt a connection that transcended the silence and the years. His hands had held these same tools. His hands had shaped them. And now her hands were learning their weight and balance, continuing the work. The cabin slowly became something solid and real. She replaced all the floorboards, installed new support beams, rebuilt the porch from the foundation up. She worked from dawn until her hands were too sore to grip the tools, then spent her evenings by lamplight, planning the next day's tasks and writing in a journal she'd started keeping. The isolation was profound, but not oppressive. She'd grown used to solitude over the years, and here in the mountains it felt natural rather than lonely. She saw deer every morning, watched hawks circling overhead, listened to the wind move through the trees like breathing. At night, the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Once a week, she made the drive down to Ridgeline for supplies. She'd given notice at the hardware store, but they'd kept her on the books, letting her pick up occasional shifts when she needed cash. Her boss, a weathered man named Frank, who'd owned the place for 30 years, had taken her decision to move to the mountains with characteristic stoicism. "Place'll still be here if you change your mind," he'd said, and that was that. On one of these supply runs, she ran into Judith in the grocery store parking lot. Her sister was loading bags into the back of a sedan, moving with the careful precision of someone whose back hurt more than they wanted to admit. She looked older than Corinne remembered from the lawyer's office, more worn down, more tired. When she turned and saw Corinne, her expression went carefully neutral. "Corinne, Judith." They stood there for a moment, two sisters who'd once shared a bedroom and whispered secrets in the dark, now strangers who happened to share blood. "I heard you're living up at that cabin," Judith said finally. "Heard you quit your job. Word travels fast. Small town." Judith closed the trunk of her car, then seemed to hesitate. "Vincent says the place was falling apart. Says you're wasting your time trying to fix it." Corinne felt the familiar defensiveness rising in her chest, but pushed it down. "It's coming along. It needed work, but it has good bones. Everything up there needs work. Middle of nowhere, no power, no phone service. I don't understand what you're trying to prove." There it was. The assumption that everything Corinne did was about proving something, about defying them, about being contrary for its own sake. "I'm not trying to prove anything," Corinne said quietly. "I'm just fixing what's broken." Judith's eyes narrowed slightly. "The cabin or yourself?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and unexpected. Before Corinne could respond, Judith shook her head. "Never mind. It's not my business what you do." She got in her car and drove away, leaving Corinne standing in the parking lot with a cart full of lumber and a chest full of things she didn't know how to say. Back at the cabin, she threw herself into the work with renewed intensity. The encounter with Judith had unsettled her, scratched at old wounds she'd thought were healed. The assumption that she was performing some kind of rebellion, that her choices were reactions rather than actions. It grated. But maybe there was truth in it. Maybe she was still trying to prove something, even if she didn't want to admit it. She was working on the back wall when disaster struck. She'd been reinforcing the frame, adding new supports to replace rotted studs, when she heard the ominous crack of wood giving way. She jumped back just in time as a section of wall she'd just rebuilt collapsed inward, taking half the roof edge with it. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the destruction. Hours of work gone. The careful measurements, the precise cuts, the heavy beams she'd hauled into place, all of it now a heap of broken lumber and crushed hope. She sat down hard on the ground, fighting back tears of frustration. This was impossible. She was one person with limited tools and even more limited resources, trying to rebuild something that maybe wasn't worth saving in the first place. Vincent was right. Judith was right. This was a waste of time. She sat there until the sun started to set, until the shadows grew long and the evening chill crept into her bones. Then slowly, a memory surfaced, herself at 12 years old, standing in the barn watching her father rebuild a doorframe that had warped in the winter damp. She'd asked him why he didn't just buy a new door, and he'd looked at her with something close to surprise. "Because this one can be fixed," he'd said. "And fixing something teaches you more than replacing it ever will." He'd shown her how to plane the wood, how to check for square, how to hang it so it swung true. He'd been patient that day, his movements deliberate, his instructions clear. It was one of the few times she remembered him teaching her something without frustration or criticism, just the calm transfer of knowledge from his hands to hers. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her jeans, and went to get her father's tools. This time, she'd reinforce from the inside out. She'd build a frame within the frame, something that couldn't collapse no matter how much pressure the old structure put on it. It took 3 days of careful work, but when she was finished, the wall was stronger than it had been originally. The setback had forced her to think differently, to solve the problem instead of just covering it up. That night, she sat on the newly rebuilt porch with a cup of coffee, looking at the cabin in the fading light. It was taking shape. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. The windows were all intact now, the roof was sound, the walls were straight. It was beginning to look like a place where someone could actually live. She pulled out her journal and wrote by lamplight, her father's pocket watch sitting on the table beside her. The hands still pointed to 3:47, forever frozen in that moment of departure. But she was moving forward, even if his watch wasn't. "I'm getting there," she whispered to the darkness, to the memory of her father, to herself. "It's slow, but I'm getting there." The mountains held their silence, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, just being solid and patient and endlessly present. 2 months into the project, Corinne made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been working on the ceiling, installing insulation in the rafters, when her hand brushed against something that didn't belong. She pulled it down carefully, a photo album, wrapped in plastic and wedged between 2 beams where it had stayed dry despite the cabin's deteriorating condition. Her hands trembled. As she opened it, the first page held a picture of herself at maybe 7 years old, standing on a fence rail with her arms spread wide like she was flying. She was grinning at the camera, gap-toothed and fearless. On the back, in her father's handwriting, "Corinne, age 7, wants to do everything herself. Wonder where she gets that." She flipped through page after page, each one a moment from her childhood she'd half forgotten, her first day of school. A birthday party. Christmas morning. Working in the garden with her mother. Learning to drive the tractor, but it wasn't just childhood photos. There were pictures from her teenage years, her high school graduation, a photo from the county fair where she'd won a blue ribbon for her woodworking project. And then, impossibly, there were photos from after she'd left, a newspaper clipping from a local paper in Colorado, showing her at a community event. A grainy photo that looked like it had been taken from across a street, showing her walking out of a building she barely remembered. A wedding announcement. Her marriage to Tommy, clipped from some small-town gazette. Her father had been tracking her life. For years, maybe decades, he'd been collecting any scrap of information he could find about where she was and what she was doing. Every photo, every clipping, had notes on the back in his handwriting. Small observations, questions he'd never asked, pride he'd never expressed. "My girl," he'd written on the back of her high school graduation photo. Stubborn like her old man, but twice as smart. Corinne sat on the floor of the cabin, the album open in her lap, and wept. Not the quiet tears she'd shed over the letter, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. All those years, she'd thought he'd forgotten her, dismissed her, written her off as the disappointment who'd ruined the family name. He'd been keeping track. He'd been watching from a distance, caring in the only way his pride would allow. Someone had been helping him. Someone in the family had been feeding him information, sending him these fragments of her life. But who? The question consumed her for days. She kept working on the cabin. The physical labor helped settle her mind. But between tasks, she'd pull out the album and study it, trying to figure out who the intermediary had been. Not Vincent, certainly. He'd made his position clear at the lawyer's office. That left Judith. After a week of deliberation, Corinne made a decision. She cleaned herself up, drove down to Ridgeline, and at the post office bought a card and a stamp. She wrote carefully, "Judith, I found something at the cabin. I think we need to talk. Would you be willing to meet me there? Saturday afternoon, if you can." Corinne, she mailed it before she could second-guess herself, then spent the next 4 days in an agony of anticipation and dread. She cleaned the cabin obsessively, organized her tools, even picked wildflowers and put them in a jar on the table. Then she felt foolish and threw them out, then regretted it and picked more. Saturday arrived cool and clear. Corinne was on the porch, pretending to work on the railing, when she heard the sound of a vehicle coming up the track. Her heart hammered as Judith's sedan came into view, navigating the rough road with visible difficulty. Her sister got out slowly, looking around with an expression Corinne couldn't quite read. "I didn't think you'd actually be able to make this place livable," Judith said, walking closer. "But it looks good. Really good. Thank you for coming. Your note said you found something." Corinne went inside and brought out the photo album. It was in the rafters, hidden but protected, like he wanted to keep it safe. Judith took the album with hands that shook slightly. She opened it, and Corinne watched her sister's face transform as she turned the pages, surprise giving way to recognition. Recognition to something that might have been guilt or might have been grief. "It was you," Corinne said quietly. "You sent him the information." "The photos, the clippings," Judith nodded without looking up. "He asked me to. Not directly, never directly. But he'd mention you sometimes, wonder out loud where you were, what you were doing. So I started looking. It wasn't hard. Mutual friends, people who'd known you growing up and heard things through the grapevine. I'd clip articles, send photos when I could find them. Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what?" "That Dad was too proud to reach out, but not too proud to track your life from a distance." Judith finally looked up, her eyes wet. "You'd left, Corinne. You'd made your choice. I thought if you knew he still cared, it would just hurt worse. For both of you. And Vincent?" Vincent knew. He was angry about it, thought I was betraying the family by staying in contact even indirectly. "We fought about it more times than I can count." Judith closed the album carefully, but I couldn't stop. "You're my sister. He was my father. The silence was killing all of us, and I thought, I don't know what I thought. That maybe someday it would matter." They stood there for a long moment. Two sisters separated by decades of misunderstanding. The photo album between them like a bridge finally revealed. "I missed you," Judith said, her voice breaking. "Every day I missed you. We all did, but no one knew how to fix it. Dad's pride, your anger, Vincent's righteousness, it was like we were all trapped in roles we couldn't escape." Corinne felt her own throat tighten. "I missed you too. I told myself I didn't, that I was better off alone. But I missed you every single day." "Come here and help me with this porch," Corinne said, needing to do something with her hands, needing to move before the emotion overwhelmed her. To her surprise, Judith did. They worked together for the next 2 hours, Judith holding boards steady while Corinne measured and cut, both of them falling into a rhythm that felt familiar despite the years between. They'd worked together as children, helped their mother in the garden, their father in the barn. Their hands remembered what their hearts had forgotten. As they worked, they talked. Small things at first, Judith's children, now grown with kids of their own. Corinne's years of wandering, the jobs she'd held, the places she'd seen. Then deeper things, the loneliness they'd both felt, the weight of family expectations, the ways they'd each failed and survived. "Vincent is drowning," Judith said suddenly, as they were attaching the last railing post. "The farm, I mean. He won't admit it, but it's in trouble. Has been for years. Dad's death just made it worse. There were debts no one knew about, equipment that needs replacing, irrigation systems failing." Corinne straightened, hammer in hand. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I don't know if he can save it. He's too proud to ask for help, working himself into the ground trying to do it alone." Judith met her eyes. "Just like someone else I know." The parallel was obvious. Vincent, carrying the weight of the family legacy alone, refusing to bend or break or ask for assistance. Just like their father. Just like, if she was honest, Corinne herself. "When you finish here," Judith said carefully, "maybe you could come by the farm. Just for a day. Just to see it again." Corinne felt resistance rise automatically, the old instinct to protect herself, to keep distance, to avoid the pain of rejection. But she looked at her sister's face, saw the hope there mixed with fear, and felt something shift. "Maybe," she said. "When I'm done here, maybe." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. It was possibility, and right now that felt like enough. Judith left as the sun was setting. But the air between them was different, warmer, more open, like a door that had been locked for decades, had finally cracked open just enough to let light through. That night, Corinne sat on her completed porch with the photo album open beside her. She ran her fingers over the pictures, over her father's handwriting, over the evidence of love that had persisted despite silence, despite distance, despite pride. The cabin was almost finished. Another few weeks and it would be done. Weatherproof, solid, a real home. She'd set out to prove she could rebuild something broken, and she had. But somewhere along the way, the project had changed. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It wasn't even about proving herself capable. It was about understanding that broken things could be made whole again. That time stopped for no one, but bridges could still be built. That sometimes the hardest work wasn't fixing a building, it was fixing a heart. She picked up her father's pocket watch from the table beside her. Still stopped at 3:47, but maybe that was all right. Maybe some things were meant to stay broken, to serve as reminders of what was lost. The important thing was that she kept moving forward, even when his watch couldn't. "I'm coming home," she whispered to the darkness, testing the words. "Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but I'm coming home." The mountains held their peace, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to the rising moon. By early August, spring had given way to summer, and the cabin had transformed into something Corinne barely recognized. The structure that had been collapsing under its own weight 3 months ago now stood straight and strong, with fresh paint on the exterior and new glass gleaming in every window. She'd built a proper porch, with railings and steps that didn't creak or sag. She'd installed a rain collection system and improved the wood stove's ventilation. The interior was clean and organized, with new shelving, a repaired loft and floorboards that didn't threaten to give way underfoot. It felt like home. more than any apartment or rented room she'd lived in over the past 3 decades. This place felt like it belonged to her, or maybe she belonged to it. She was working in the yard one morning, clearing brush and rocks to expand the area around the cabin, when her shovel hit something metal. She knelt down and dug carefully with her hands, uncovering an old brass compass half buried in the dirt, near what looked like the remains of an ancient fire pit. The compass was tarnished but intact, its glass face cracked but still readable. When she wiped away the dirt, she could see an engraving on the back, M.A. 1943 M.A., her grandmother. Margaret Alder, the woman who'd left when her father was a boy, the woman who'd haunted their family like a ghost, the original abandoner whose shadow had stretched across 3 generations. Corinne opened the compass carefully. Despite decades in the ground, the needle still swung free, settling after a moment to point north. Always north, always true, no matter how long it had been buried or forgotten. She sat back on her heels, turning the compass over in her hands. What had her grandmother been doing out here? This property hadn't been part of the farm back then. Her father had bought it later in life. But maybe Margaret had come here before that, when it was just wild mountain land. Maybe she'd had her own reasons for seeking isolation, her own need for space that her family couldn't understand. The thought gnawed at Corinne. She'd grown up hearing Margaret Alder spoken of in whispers, always with judgment, always with shame. The woman who'd abandoned her children, the mother who'd walked away. But what if there was more to the story? What if, like Corinne herself, Margaret had been pushed as much as she'd chosen to leave? On her next trip to Ridgeline, Corinne stopped at the public library. She spent hours in the archives, searching through old newspapers and county records, looking for any mention of Margaret Alder. What she found surprised her. Margaret Alder, née Margaret Hayes, had been declared mentally unfit by her husband's family in 1944. There was a court record, a petition filed by James Alder Sr., her grandfather, claiming his wife was unstable, unable to care for her children, a danger to herself and the family's reputation. Margaret had been sent away, not to a hospital, but simply cast out, with no legal right to see her children again. There was no record of her death, no grave in the family plot. She'd simply vanished from the public record after the court judgment, as if she'd never existed at all. Corinne sat in the library's quiet reading room, stunned. Her grandmother hadn't abandoned anyone. She'd been forced out, declared unfit by people who had the power to make such declarations stick. And her crime. The records were vague, but reading between the lines, it seemed Margaret had been too independent, too outspoken, too unwilling to accept the role her husband's family had carved out for her, just like Corinne, just like her father, who'd learned to fear independence in women because he'd watched his mother be destroyed for it. 3 generations, all caught in the same trap. Margaret forced out for refusing to conform. James, terrified of losing anyone else, trying to control what he couldn't afford to lose. Corinne, running from control, not knowing she was repeating a pattern that stretched back before her birth. She made copies of everything she'd found and drove back up to the cabin in a daze. That night, she sat on her porch with the compass in one hand and her father's pocket watch in the other. 2 artifacts, 2 stories, 2 kinds of time stopped by trauma and loss, but the compass still pointed north, still showed the way forward even after being buried for decades. The next morning, Judith's car appeared on the track again. This time her sister looked less hesitant, more purposeful. She got out with a basket over her arm. "I brought lunch," she called. "Thought you might be tired of eating out of cans." They ate on the porch, sandwiches and fruit, cookies Judith had baked that morning. The food was simple, but tasted better than anything Corinne had eaten in months. They talked about small things at first, safe topics, but eventually Corinne brought out the compass and the papers she'd copied at the library. Judith read through them slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something like horror. "Dad never told us this. He said she left, that she chose to go. Maybe he believed that. Maybe he had to believe it." Corinne held the compass up to the sunlight. Or maybe he knew and couldn't face it, that his father had done something unforgivable, and admitting it would mean admitting our whole family was built on a lie. The pattern, Judith said quietly. Margaret was cast out for being too independent. Dad tried to control you for the same reason. And Vincent, she stopped, her face troubled. What about Vincent? He's doing the same thing Dad did. Working himself to death, trying to control everything. Convinced that if he just holds tight enough, nothing will fall apart. But it's all falling apart anyway. They sat in silence for a while, watching clouds move across the sky. Finally, Judith spoke again. Would you come to the farm? Not just for a visit. Would you come to help? Corinne felt her chest tighten. Judith, I don't know if Vincent won't ask. You know he won't. His pride won't let him. But we're going to lose the farm if something doesn't change. And I think maybe you're the change we need. You know how to rebuild broken things. You've proved that here. She gestured at the cabin, at everything Corinne had accomplished. Maybe you could help us rebuild what's broken there too. The invitation hung between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Going back to the farm meant confronting Vincent's resentment, the community's judgment, her own complicated feelings about the place that had shaped and scarred her. It meant stepping back into a role she'd spent 35 years, escaping, but it also meant family, belonging, the chance to break the cycle that had trapped 3 generations of older women. Let me finish here first, Corinne said finally. Another few weeks, and the cabin will be complete. Then maybe I'll come see what needs doing. Judith's face lit with relief and hope. That's all I'm asking. Just come see. After her sister left, Corinne stood in the yard holding the compass, watching the needle settle toward north. Her grandmother had held this same compass once, had used it to find her way through these same mountains. She'd been lost in a different sense, cast out, alone, judged unfit for refusing to be less than she was. But the compass had survived, had stayed buried but not broken, waiting to be found, waiting to point the way home for someone else who'd lost their direction. Corinne hung the compass on a nail by the cabin door, next to where she'd mounted a small shelf for her father's pocket watch. 2 artifacts, 2 kinds of inheritance, one frozen in time, one showing the way forward. She was beginning to understand that both were necessary. You had to remember what was broken, carry the weight of what was lost. But you also had to keep moving, keep seeking true north, keep believing that forward motion was possible, even when the past pulled at your heels. The cabin was almost done. Soon, she'd have to decide what came next, stay here in peaceful isolation, or return to the farm and the family that had both wounded and shaped her. But tonight, she didn't have to decide. Tonight, she could just sit on her porch and watch the stars emerge, feeling the solid wood beneath her and knowing she'd built something real, something that would last, something that proved broken things could be made whole again if you were willing to do the work. The cabin was finished. Corinne stood back on a warm afternoon in late August and looked at her work with a mixture of pride and disbelief. 4 months ago, this place had been a ruin. Now it was solid and beautiful, with clean lines and careful details that spoke of patience and skill. She'd rebuilt it from the foundation up, using her father's tools and his techniques, finishing what he'd started. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt strangely hollow, like the completion of the project had left a void that needed filling. She was sweeping the porch when she noticed a drawer she'd installed under the kitchen counter was sticking slightly. When she pulled it all the way out to plane the runners, she found a ledger book wedged behind it, tucked in the gap between the drawer box and the cabinet frame. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Page after page of her father's handwriting, entries dating back 23 years. Financial records, but not for the farm. These were separate, marked clearly at the top of each page. Cabin fund. He'd been setting aside money for decades. Small amounts at first, $20 here, $50 there. Later, larger sums as his circumstances improved. Every entry was labeled with what it was for: roof materials, window glass, lumber for porch, foundation repair. But scattered between the financial notations were other entries. Personal notes that made her throat ache. Corinne always liked blue. Paint the shutters blue when the time comes. Strong girl. This place needs strong hands like hers. Saw her in town today. She didn't see me. She looked tired but determined. Always determined. Hope she forgives an old man his foolish pride. Hope this place gives her what I couldn't. Peace. The ledger documented 23 years of preparation, of planning, of love expressed through lumber and nails and careful financial management. This wasn't a last-minute decision made when he knew he was dying. This was a lifetime project, a slow building of something he'd hoped she'd someday want. He'd known he couldn't say the words, couldn't bridge the gap his pride had created. So he'd built a bridge instead, one board at a time, $1 at a time, hoping she'd be willing to cross it. Corinne sat at the kitchen table, a table she'd built herself with his tools, and wept over the ledger. Not the sharp grief of fresh loss, but something deeper and more complicated. Gratitude mixed with regret, understanding mixed with sorrow for all the wasted years. The next morning, she locked the cabin door, loaded her truck with tools and supplies, and drove to the family farm. She hadn't been back since the day at the lawyer's office. Hadn't let herself even drive past it on her trips to town. Now, pulling up the long gravel driveway, she felt 35 years collapse into nothing. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The white farmhouse with its wraparound porch, the big red barn, the machine shed, the fields stretching out in every direction under an endless sky. Vincent was in the yard, working on a tractor that had clearly seen better days. He straightened when he heard her truck, his expression cycling through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been resignation. "Judith said you might come," he said, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. "Didn't think you actually would. Can I look around?" He shrugged. "It's your property too now. Might as well see what you've gotten yourself into." The bitterness in his voice was familiar, but beneath it, Corinne heard something else. Exhaustion, fear, the sound of a man holding on by his fingernails and knowing it wasn't enough. She walked the property for 2 hours, seeing everything her brother was too proud to show her. Fence lines sagging, barn roofs patched with tarps, equipment that was older than she was, held together with wire and prayer. Fields that should have been green and thriving, showing stress from inadequate irrigation. It was worse than she'd imagined. The farm wasn't just struggling, it was dying. She found Vincent in the barn, staring at a pile of broken harrow teeth like they represented all his failures made manifest. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long what? How long have you been trying to hold this together alone?" He was silent for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then since Dad got sick, 5 years maybe. He'd let things slide more than any of us knew. Equipment needed replacing, but he kept putting it off. Irrigation system failed, but he didn't have the money to fix it properly. By the time he died, there were debts no one knew about. Loans against the property. Back taxes. Why didn't you ask for help?" Vincent's laugh was bitter. "From who? Judith's got her own family to support. And you made it pretty clear you wanted nothing to do with this place. That's not fair, isn't it?" He finally looked at her, and she saw the pain behind the anger. "You left, Corinne? You walked away from all of this. From him, from us, from the responsibility. What were we supposed to think? That you'd come back if we just asked nicely. You never asked at all. Neither did you." The words hung between them, sharp and true. They'd both been too proud, too hurt, too convinced of their own righteousness to bend. Just like their father, just like every older who'd come before them. "I found his ledger," Corinne said. "At the cabin. He'd been planning that place for me for over 20 years. Setting aside money, making notes about what I'd like, documenting every step." Vincent's face shifted slightly. "He talked about you constantly, near the end especially. Corinne would know how to fix this. Corinne always had good hands for building. Wonder if Corinne's happy wherever she is." He paused. "I was jealous. My whole life I did what I was supposed to do, stayed, worked, sacrificed, and he spent his last years thinking about the daughter who left." "He was thinking about all of us," Corinne said quietly. "He just didn't know how to say it. The cabin was for me, but this," she gestured at the farm around them, "this was for you. His whole life's work. The problem is, he taught us to work, but not to ask for help. To be strong, but not to be honest. To carry burdens, but not to share them. So what do you want me to do? Fall on my knees and beg you to save the place? I want you to let me help. As a partner, as family. Vincent studied her for a long moment. And what do you get out of it? A chance to prove you can succeed where I've failed? A chance to stop running, Corinne said. A chance to break the pattern that destroyed our grandmother, paralyzed our father, and scattered us all. A chance to prove that Alder doesn't have to mean alone. She pulled out the ledger and showed him the final entry, written just weeks before their father's death. If Corinne finds this, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I understand now. Tell her that some things are worth more than pride, family being the first among them. Tell her I love her. I should have said it when I had the chance. Vincent read it twice, his jaw working like he was trying to swallow something too big. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He showed me your name in the family Bible, Vincent said roughly. Right before he died. He'd crossed it out when you left. I watched him do it, thought he was finally accepting you were gone for good. But then, the week before his heart gave out, he called me into his study, showed me the Bible with your name restored. She's coming home, he said. Like he knew, like he'd planned it all along. He closed the ledger carefully and handed it back to her. I don't know if I can do this. Work with you, I mean. Share this place. It's been mine to fail at for so long, I don't know how to do it any other way. We'll figure it out, Corinne said. Together. The way we should have been doing all along. That evening, she sat with both her siblings at the farmhouse table, the first time they'd shared a meal in 35 years. They talked late into the night, making plans, dividing responsibilities, facing the brutal reality of the farm's finances. The situation was worse than Vincent had admitted. They had maybe a year before the bank would foreclose. Maybe less. We could sell off some land, Judith suggested. Enough to pay down the debt by time. No. The word came from all three of them simultaneously. Selling land was admitting defeat, breaking up the farm that had been in the family for 4 generations. Then we work, Corinne said. We put everything we have into this place for the next year. We fix what's broken, we modernize what we can afford to modernize, and we make this farm profitable again. And if we fail? Vincent asked. Then at least we fail together, as a family, the way Dad wanted, even if he didn't know how to make it happen. Vincent reached across the table and offered his hand. After a moment, Corinne took it. Then Judith put her hand over both of theirs. 3 siblings, bound by blood and land, and the complicated legacy of a man who'd loved them all in his imperfect, inarticulate way. I'll need to go back to the cabin sometimes, Corinne said. For thinking. For space. I need to know I have that. The cabin's yours, Vincent said. It always was. Dad made sure of that. That night, Corinne slept in her childhood bedroom. The bed was the same one she'd left behind, the curtains faded but familiar. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of 35 years of choices settling on her chest. She'd left this place to find herself. Now she was coming back to find family, and somehow, impossibly, both things felt right. 3 weeks later, Corinne was in the barn repairing a section of hayloft when her phone buzzed with a text from Judith. Can you come to town? Lawyer's office. Says it's important. She found Vincent already there when she arrived, looking as confused as she felt. Parsons greeted them with the same measured professionalism he'd shown at the will reading. But there was something different in his expression now. Anticipation, maybe, or concern. Thank you both for coming on short notice, he said, gesturing them to chairs. Corinne, I have something for you. Your father left specific instructions with me. A sealed letter that was to be delivered only under certain conditions. What conditions? Corinne asked, her heart already starting to race. That you completed substantial work on the cabin property. I was to verify this myself before releasing the letter. He smiled slightly. I drove up there yesterday. I must say, what you've accomplished is remarkable. The structure is not only repaired but improved. Your father would be proud. He slid a thick envelope across the desk. Corinne's name was written on it in her father's handwriting, with a date from 5 years ago, before his health had started failing. Before any of them had known time was running short, her hands shook as she opened it. "Corinne, if you're reading this, it means you've rebuilt the cabin. It means you took something broken and made it whole again. It means you're ready for what comes next. I'm dying. The doctors say I have a year, maybe 2 if I'm lucky. I'm not afraid of death, but I'm terrified of leaving things unfinished. Of leaving you and Vincent and Judith scattered, unable to find your way back to each other. The cabin was a test, but not the kind you probably think. I wasn't testing whether you were strong enough or skilled enough. I already knew you were. I was testing whether you were ready to forgive, ready to rebuild not just structures but relationships, ready to come home, not because you had to, but because you chose to. Now I need to tell you the truth about the farm. Vincent doesn't know this yet. Judith might suspect, but she doesn't know the full extent. The farm is in serious trouble. I made poor decisions, borrowed against the land when I should have sold equipment, tried to expand when I should have consolidated, trusted the wrong people with investments that went bad. By the time I understood how deep the hole was, I didn't know how to climb out. I've been too proud to ask for help, and that pride is going to cost Vincent everything if someone doesn't intervene. He's trying to save this place alone, just like I did, and he's going to fail just like I would have. So here's what I've done. I've divided my estate in a way that wasn't revealed in the first will reading. Vincent and Judith received the farm and all its assets, as they expected. But I've also left you something that wasn't mentioned. A 40% ownership stake in the farm itself, equal to your siblings. The lawyer has the amended documents. Your siblings will receive them at the same time you receive this letter. I know what you're thinking. This feels like manipulation, like control from beyond the grave. Maybe it is, but it's also the only way I could think to bring you all back together. Vincent needs help he won't ask for. You need a reason to come home that doesn't feel like surrender. And Judith needs her family whole again. The ownership comes with a condition. You have to claim it in person at the farm, in front of your brother and sister. And you have to commit to working the farm for at least 2 years to help restore it to profitability. If you refuse, the stake reverts to Vincent and Judith equally, but the farm will almost certainly be lost within the year. I gave you the cabin first so you'd know you could survive alone. So you'd know that coming back to the farm is a choice, not a necessity. You have a place of your own now, a refuge, something no one can take from you. The cabin was your declaration of independence. Now I'm asking you to choose interdependence, to choose family. Not because you're weak or desperate or have nowhere else to go, but because you're strong enough to rebuild what I broke. I taught you to build, Corinne. I taught you to measure twice and cut once, to respect the wood, to understand that sometimes you have to tear down before you can build up. Now I'm asking you to use those skills on something more important than a building. I'm asking you to rebuild this family. I know I have no right to ask. I know I'm the one who drove you away, who made you feel like you had to choose between being yourself and being an Alder. I know I failed you in ways that can't be undone, but I believe in you. I believe you're strong enough and wise enough and compassionate enough to do what I couldn't, to hold on to yourself while holding on to family, to be independent and interconnected at the same time. The farm is your inheritance if you want it, not as a burden but as an opportunity, a chance to break the cycle that destroyed my mother, crippled me, and scattered us all. I love you. I should have said it every day. I'm sorry I didn't. Your father, Corinne, read the letter twice, then a third time, while Parsons waited patiently and Vincent sat frozen in his chair. When she finally looked up, the lawyer was already sliding more documents across the desk. The amended ownership papers, he said. As your father specified, you now own 40% of the Alder farm, with Vincent and Judith each holding 30%. All 3 of you must sign these documents for the transfer to be official and for the farm to remain in family ownership. He never told us, Vincent said, his voice strained. He never said a word about this. He wrote this 5 years ago, Corinne said, showing him the date on the letter. Before you ever knew the farm was in trouble. Before I came back. He planned all of it. He manipulated us, Vincent said, but there was no heat in it, just exhaustion and a strange kind of wonder. From the grave. He tried to save us, Corinne corrected quietly. The only way he knew how. Parsons cleared his throat. I should mention, there's more. Your father established a trust that becomes active when all three siblings sign the ownership papers. It contains enough capital to address the farm's immediate debt and fund essential repairs to equipment and infrastructure. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to give you breathing room. Where did he get that kind of money? Vincent asked. He sold mineral rights to a portion of the property that wasn't productive farmland, a corner parcel near Blacktail Ridge. The sale was completed 3 years ago, and he put every penny in trust for this purpose, the cabin property, the land he'd given Corinne. He'd sold part of it to create a fund that would save the rest. Vincent stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to them. I don't know if I can do this, he said. Sign over control. Admit I couldn't save it myself. Work alongside. He stopped, but they all knew what he'd been about to say. Work alongside the sister who left us. You wouldn't be signing over control, Parsons said. You'd be accepting partnership. All major decisions would require agreement from at least 2 of the 3 owners. No one person has final authority, Vincent, Corinne said softly. I know how this feels. I know what it's like to have your choices taken away, to feel like you're being controlled, even after someone's gone. But we can choose how we respond to this. We can see it as manipulation, or we can see it as what? A gift? Vincent turned, and she saw tears on his face. He didn't trust me to save the farm. He didn't think I was capable. He knew you were too much like him, Corinne said. Too proud to ask for help, too willing to carry everything alone. He wasn't saying you were weak. He was saying the weight was too much for any one person. The condition stands, Parsons said. If you choose not to sign, Corinne, the ownership reverts to your siblings equally, but the trust fund is not released. Your father was very specific about that. All 3 of you must agree, or the farm faces foreclosure within 6 to 8 months. Corinne looked at the papers in front of her, then at her brother's face, seeing the war between pride and desperation playing out in his expression. This was the moment everything turned on. She could refuse, could walk away and let Vincent and Judith face the consequences of their father's manipulations. Or she could sign, could commit to 2 years minimum on the farm, could step into the role her father had engineered for her. But was she signing because she wanted to, or because she was being coerced? Was she choosing family or just doing what was expected again? She thought of the cabin, solid and beautiful in the mountains. Her place, her achievement, her proof that she could survive alone. Then she thought of the photo album, the ledger, the compass that still pointed north. 3 generations of older women, all lost in different ways. Margaret forced out, Corinne driven away, and now offered a chance to break the pattern. I need time, she said. I need to think about this without pressure, without an audience. Can I take the papers with me? Parsons nodded. You have 30 days to make your decision. After that, the offer expires and the trust is dissolved. Corinne gathered the documents and walked out, leaving Vincent and the lawyer behind. She drove straight to the cabin, her sanctuary, her proof of independence. She spent 3 days there alone, walking the property, sitting on the porch she'd built, holding her father's pocket watch and her grandmother's compass. On the 3rd day, Judith appeared. She didn't ask what Corinne had decided. She just sat beside her on the porch and waited. I'm terrified, Corinne finally said. Terrified of going back there and losing myself again. Terrified of choosing family and having it break me the way it broke our grandmother, the way it broke Dad. But you're not them, Judith said. You've already proved you can stand alone. You don't need the farm. That's what makes you strong enough to choose it. What if we fail? What if we can't save it? Then we fail together, and we'll still have this, Judith gestured at the cabin. Your place, your achievement, something Dad gave you that no one can take away. Corinne looked at the compass hanging by the door, its needle steady and true. He gave me this place so I'd know I had a choice, she said slowly. So coming back would be about wanting to, not having to. So what do you want? It was the question Corinne had been avoiding. Not what should she do, or what would be right, or what others expected. What did she want? She wanted family. Complicated, difficult, imperfect family. She wanted to break the cycle of abandonment and silence. She wanted to prove that you could be yourself and still belong somewhere. She wanted to go home. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. "I'll sign," she said. "I'll do the 2 years. But the cabin stays mine. My name on the deed, my refuge when I need it. I won't give that up. No one's asking you to," Judith said, pulling her into a hug. "Welcome home, sister." The signing took place on a September morning at the farm, with Parsons present as witness. Vincent had barely spoken to Corinne in the days since the lawyer's office, but he was there, papers in hand, his face set in that familiar expression of resigned determination. They sat at the kitchen table where they'd eaten as children, the same scarred oak surface where their mother had kneaded bread, where their father had done the farm accounts, where 1,000 family meals had been shared before silence fractured everything. "Before we sign," Vincent said, his voice rough, "I need to say something." Corinne and Judith waited. "I was wrong about you," he said, looking directly at Corinne. "About everything. I thought you left because you didn't care about us, because you were selfish or weak or couldn't handle real work. But you left because staying was killing you, and I was too blind to see it." He paused, his jaw working. Dad saw it, though. Even if he couldn't fix it while he was alive, he saw it. He knew you needed to leave to become who you were supposed to be. And he knew I needed you to come back to save what he'd built. "Vincent, let me finish." He pulled out the family Bible, the heavy leather-bound book that had recorded older births and deaths for 5 generations. He opened it to the family tree page and showed them Corinne's name. It had been crossed out in heavy black ink. She could see where the pen had pressed hard enough to dent the paper. But over the crossed-out name, in different ink, careful letters had restored it. The restoration was obvious, impossible to miss, a visible record of rejection and acceptance layered on top of each other. "He did that the week before he died," Vincent said. "Called me in, showed me, said she's coming home. I thought he'd lost his mind. But he knew. Somehow he knew you'd come back if he just built you the right kind of bridge." "He understood her better than we did," Judith said softly. "Better than she understood herself, maybe." Parsons cleared his throat. "If we're ready," they signed. All 3 of them, their names appearing one after another on the legal documents that made them equal partners in the Alder farm. When it was done, Parsons notarized the papers and explained the trust fund release, enough to pay down 60% of the farm's debt and purchase essential equipment repairs. "You're not out of the woods yet," he warned. "This buys you time and resources, but you'll still need to make the farm profitable again. That's going to take work, a lot of it." "We know," Corinne said. "We're ready." After Parsons left, the 3 siblings sat in silence for a long moment. Then Vincent stood. "I suppose we should figure out how this is going to work. Division of labor, responsibilities, who handles what." They spent the rest of the morning planning. Vincent would continue managing the field operations, planting, harvesting, crop rotation. He knew that work better than anyone, had been doing it his whole life. Judith would handle the financial management and deal with suppliers, creditors, and buyers. She'd been doing the farm's books for years anyway, keeping track of accounts while raising her children. Corinne would take on the structural work, repairing buildings, maintaining equipment, upgrading systems. Everything she'd learned restoring the cabin would be useful here. The farm's infrastructure had been neglected for too long, and someone needed to address it systematically. "We'll need to hire some help," Judith said, looking at the numbers. "Even with the 3 of us, there's too much work. What can we afford?" Vincent asked. 1 or 2 part-time workers, maybe? For harvest, definitely. But we'll need to be careful." They worked through the afternoon, creating schedules and lists, identifying priorities, and making hard decisions about what could wait and what absolutely couldn't. By evening, they had something that looked almost like a workable plan. "First thing," Corinne said, "is the main barn. The roof is going to fail if we don't address it before winter. And if we lose the barn, we lose storage for equipment, hay, everything. How long will it take?" Vincent asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3, if I work full days and the weather holds. I'll help, he said. In the mornings, before field work. I'm not letting you do this alone. It was the first real offer of partnership he'd made, and Corinne felt something tight in her chest loosen. All right, she said. We start tomorrow. That night, lying in her childhood bed once again, Corinne felt the weight of what she'd committed to pressing down on her. 2 years minimum. 2 years of working alongside a brother who still resented her, on a farm that might fail, despite their best efforts, in a community that remembered her as the girl who'd abandoned her family. But she also felt something else, a sense of rightness, of purpose, of finally moving forward instead of just running away. The work began at dawn. Vincent met her at the barn with a ladder and tools, and they started stripping the damaged sections of roof. The physical labor was familiar and grounding, and as they worked, they began to talk. Small things at first. Observations about the structure, memories of helping their father with barn repairs when they were children. He was patient when he taught us, Vincent said, prying up a rotted board. That was the only time I ever saw him really patient, when he was showing us how to do something with our hands. He loved the work more than the talking, Corinne agreed. I think that's why the letter was so hard for him. Words weren't his language. What was? This. She gestured at the barn, the farm, the cabin miles away in the mountains. Building, creating, making things that would outlast him. They worked in companionable silence after that, finding a rhythm that felt natural despite the decades of separation. By midday, they'd made real progress, and Corinne could see the structure taking better shape under their combined effort. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Morning work on the barn with Vincent, afternoons on equipment maintenance while he worked the fields, evenings planning with Judith. Slowly, painfully, they began functioning as a team rather than 3 individuals, forced into proximity. But the real test came 2 weeks into the work, when the main tractor, the one essential piece of equipment they absolutely couldn't afford to replace, broke down completely during fall plowing. Vincent discovered it mid-morning, the engine seized and smoking. He came to find Corinne in the barn, his face gray with stress. It's done. The main tractor is finished. She followed him to the field and assessed the damage. The engine block was cracked, the transmission was shot, and multiple other systems had failed in cascade. A repair would cost nearly as much as replacement, and they had budget for neither. We can't plant without it, Vincent said, his voice tight. Can't harvest. Can't do any of the work that needs doing. Without that tractor, the farm is dead. Corinne circled the machine, thinking. She'd learned equipment repair at the hardware store, had spent years fixing everything from lawnmowers to bulldozers. This was more complicated, but the principles were the same. What if we don't repair it? She said slowly. What are you talking about? What if we rebuild it? Piece by piece. We've got 3 old tractors sitting in the equipment graveyard behind the machine shed. None of them run, but between the 3, we might have enough good parts to build one functional machine. That would take weeks. We don't have weeks. We don't have money either, Corinne pointed out. So we make time. Vincent looked at the dead tractor, then at her. You really think you can do this? I rebuilt a collapsing cabin in 4 months. I think I can rebuild a tractor. All right, he said after a long moment. Show me what you need. They spent the next 10 days in the machine shed, working from dawn until well past dark. Corinne disassembled the broken tractor completely, cataloging every part, identifying what could be salvaged and what needed replacement. Then she and Vincent dragged the old tractors from the equipment graveyard and began the painstaking process of scavenging parts. It was like solving an enormous 3-dimensional puzzle. They cleaned components, tested systems, jury-rigged solutions when proper parts weren't available. Judith brought the meals in the shed, staying to help with the smaller mechanical work. Her steady hands perfect for delicate adjustments. The community began to notice their effort. Neighbors who'd written off the older farm started stopping by, curious about what the 3 siblings were attempting. A few offered advice. Others donated spare parts they had lying around. The hardware store in Ridgeline gave them a discount on necessary supplies when word spread about what Corinne was doing. On the 10th day, they had a tractor that looked like a mechanical Frankenstein's monster, parts from 4 different machines cobbled together with ingenuity and desperation. Corinne made the final connections, checked every system twice, then climbed into the driver's seat. "Cross your fingers," she said, and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Vincent's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in 35 years. Judith actually cheered, and Corinne sat in the driver's seat of the rebuilt tractor, hands shaking with relief and exhaustion, and understood something fundamental. This was what her father had known she could do. Not just fix a broken machine, but fix what was broken between them. Take pieces that didn't seem to fit and make them work together. Rebuild from destruction something functional and strong. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Vincent asked, genuine wonder in his voice. "Dad taught me," Corinne said. "You just weren't paying attention." That night, they celebrated with a simple dinner at the farmhouse. Nothing fancy, just food and family and the satisfaction of a problem solved through cooperation. As they ate, Vincent raised his glass. "To Dad," he said. "Who knew us better than we knew ourselves?" "And to Corinne, who came back when she didn't have to." "To family," Judith added. "Broken, rebuilt, and still standing." They clinked glasses, and Corinne felt tears prick her eyes. She was home, really truly home. Not because she'd surrendered or given up her independence, but because she'd chosen this. Chosen them. Chosen to be part of something larger than herself. The cabin waited in the mountains, her refuge and her proof that she could survive alone. But here, on this farm, she was learning something just as important, that surviving alone and thriving together weren't opposites. They were both possible, both necessary, both hers to choose. The morning after the tractor triumph, Corinne woke before dawn and dressed in her father's old work clothes, canvas pants worn soft with age, a flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of him despite years in storage. From the barn, she retrieved his work gloves, the ones she'd found hanging on a nail her first day back. The leather was stiff and cracked, shaped permanently to his hands. When she pulled them on, they were too large, the fingers extending past her own. But something about wearing them felt right. Like stepping into his footprints, following a path he'd cleared, but never finished walking. Vincent was already in the yard when she emerged, coffee in hand, surveying the day's work ahead. He glanced at her gloves and his expression softened. "Those were his favorites," he said. "Wore them every day for 20 years. "They're too big," Corinne said, flexing her fingers inside the worn leather. He had big hands. "Big reach," Vincent paused. "Big heart, too, even if he couldn't show it." They stood together in the pre-dawn quiet, breathing in the smell of earth and coming autumn, and for the first time in decades, the silence between them felt peaceful rather than tense. The day's priority was clear. The main barn's structural issues had been temporarily addressed, but the roof remained compromised. With winter approaching, they couldn't afford to wait. If heavy snow found weak points, the whole structure could collapse, and with it any hope of storing equipment and feed through the cold months. "We need to strip the entire south section," Corinne said, pointing to where the roofline sagged visibly. "Replace the rafters underneath before we can put new tin on top." "That's a week's work minimum," Vincent said. "And harvest starts in 10 days. Then we work fast." They assembled scaffolding as the sun rose, the metal poles and planks creating a temporary skeleton against the barn's weathered boards. Judith arrived as they were securing the last platform. A thermos of coffee and a box of pastries balanced in her arms. "Brought reinforcements," she said, setting breakfast on a workbench. "And I called Robert Henshaw. He's sending his son over to help. Said we helped him fix his irrigation system 2 years ago, and he remembers." Vincent looked surprised. "I didn't know he'd remember that." "People remember kindness," Judith said quietly, "even when we think they've forgotten." By mid-morning, Robert Henshaw's son, a strong young man named Michael, had arrived with his own tools and a willingness to work. The 4 of them established a rhythm, Corinne and Michael on the scaffolding removing damaged tin and rotted rafters, Vincent and Judith on the ground cutting replacement beams to specification and hauling them up. The work was hard and hot, September sun beat down on the metal roof, turning the scaffolding into an oven. Sweat soaked through shirts within an hour. Hands cramped from gripping tools, backs ached from bending and lifting, but they kept moving. Corinne found herself falling into the meditative state that physical labor always brought her, the thinking mind quieting, the body taking over, problems solving themselves through muscle memory and practice skill. This was what her father had understood, that sometimes you couldn't talk your way through things. Sometimes you just had to work, to let your hands speak what your mouth couldn't. Around noon, Vincent called up from the ground. "Corinne, come look at this." She climbed down to find him examining one of the support posts they'd exposed. The wood was rotted through at the base, eaten away by decades of moisture and neglect. "This one's gone," he said. "And if this one's bad, others probably are too. We need to check every support in the barn." It was worse than they'd thought. Of the 16 main support posts, 7 showed significant rot. Not immediately catastrophic, but dangerous. Under enough weight, say from a heavy snow load on the roof they were repairing, the posts could fail. The entire structure could come down. "How did Dad miss this?" Vincent asked, more confused than angry. "He didn't miss it," Judith said quietly. "She'd come over to see what they'd found. He knew. I found notes in his desk last year when I was looking for insurance papers. He documented the damage, made plans to fix it. He ran out of time. And money, and probably couldn't face asking for help." The 3 siblings stood looking at the rotted posts, seeing in them a metaphor too obvious to ignore. Their father had held up this farm alone for so long that he'd rotted away at his foundations, and by the time anyone noticed, it was almost too late. "We replaced them," Corinne said. "All 7. Do it right." "That's another week at least," Vincent protested. "Plus the materials, then we take another week. We buy the materials, and we do it right, because if we don't, we're just covering up rot with fresh paint. We're becoming Dad, pretending everything's fine when the foundation's crumbling." Vincent met her eyes, and she saw him understand. This wasn't just about the barn. It was about the pattern they were trying to break. Do the hard work now. Be honest about the damage. Ask for help when needed. All the things their father had failed to do. "All right," he said. "We do it right." Michael Henshaw stayed through the afternoon, and by evening they'd removed all the damaged tin and exposed the full extent of the structural problems. It was daunting but no longer hidden. They could see exactly what needed fixing, and that somehow made it less frightening. The next morning, word had spread through the community about what the Alder siblings were attempting. 3 more neighbors showed up to help. Retired farmers with time on their hands and skills that hadn't faded. They came with tools and lumber, with stories about James Alder helping them years ago with this problem or that crisis. "Your dad helped me rebuild my fence line after the flood of '03, one old-timer said. "Must have been 70 years old, but he worked like a man half his age. Never asked for payment, never expected thanks. Just did it because that's what neighbors do." Another man, weathered and slow-moving, added, "He gave me a loan when the bank wouldn't back in '08, saved my place. I always meant to pay him back in kind, but never got the chance while he was alive. Figure I can help his kids now." Corinne listened to these stories and understood something she'd missed. Her father had been part of a community, had given and received help in ways his children hadn't known about. He hadn't been as alone as she'd thought. He'd just been too proud to let his family see his vulnerability, too determined to appear strong, to admit he needed support. With the additional help, the work accelerated. They replaced all 7 support posts over the next 5 days, jacking up the barn in sections, cutting away rot, installing new pressure-treated posts that would last another 50 years. The process was painstaking and precise, but with multiple hands, the burden was shared. Vincent worked alongside the volunteers with a humility Corinne had never seen in him before. He listened to advice, accepted correction, admitted when he didn't know how to solve a problem. The rigid, controlling man she remembered from childhood was softening, being reshaped by necessity and community into someone more flexible, more human. On the 6th day, as they were bolting the final support post into place, the elderly farmer who'd mentioned the fence line paused and looked at Corinne. You're the one who left, aren't you? Long time ago. Corinne tensed, expecting judgment. Yes, sir. Must have had your reasons. Takes courage to leave. Takes more courage to come back. He nodded at the barn, taking shape around them. Your daddy would be proud. You're finishing what he started. The words landed in her chest like a gift. Not forgiveness exactly. She hadn't realized she'd been seeking it, but acceptance. Permission to be both the girl who'd left and the woman who'd returned. That evening, with the support structure complete and solid, they began installing new rafters. The work went quickly now with so many hands, the fresh lumber bright against the old barn boards. By sunset, they had half the roof framed, and Corinne stood back to admire their progress. It's going to hold, she said to Vincent, who'd come to stand beside her. Thanks to you, I couldn't have done this alone. That's the point, Corinne said gently. None of us were supposed to do it alone. Vincent was quiet for a moment, then, I'm sorry for how I treated you, for resenting you coming back, for thinking you were trying to take something from me instead of giving something to all of us. I'm sorry, too, for leaving the way I did, for staying away so long, for thinking I had to choose between being myself and being part of this family. They stood shoulder to shoulder as darkness fell, two siblings rebuilding more than just a barn, rebuilding trust, rebuilding connection, rebuilding the family their father had tried to preserve through work and silence, and finally, desperately, through a will that forced them back together. Above them, the new rafters stood strong and straight, ready to bear whatever weight winter would bring. The barn roof was completed on a crisp October morning, the new tin catching sunlight like a beacon visible from the road. Neighbors driving past honked and waved, acknowledging the visible proof that the older farm was recovering, that the family everyone had written off was rebuilding something real. But the crisis wasn't over. With the structural work complete and harvest approaching, Judith called an emergency meeting in the farmhouse kitchen. She spread financial documents across the table with a grim expression. We need to talk about money, she said. The trust fund covered the immediate debt and the materials we've used, but we're still operating at a loss. Even with a good harvest, we won't break even this year. We need another source of income, or we'll be right back where we started next spring. Vincent slumped in his chair. I don't know what else to cut. We're already running minimal crew, doing most work ourselves. We're not cutting anything, Judith said. We're finding new revenue. She pulled out a document Corinne recognized, an old property survey. I've been going through Dad's papers, organizing everything, and I found this. The original survey from when the farm was established. Corinne took it, studying the familiar boundaries and landmarks. Then she saw it, a notation in the corner she'd never noticed before. Mineral rights retained by family. Exactly, Judith said. When the farm was established in 1897, our great-great-grandfather kept all mineral rights. They've never been sold or leased. Vincent leaned forward, suddenly interested. What does that mean? It means everything under the ground belongs to us, separate from the surface rights. And I've done research. The land adjacent to our eastern boundary was recently leased for natural gas exploration. There's a geological formation that runs under their property, and likely under ours too. Are you suggesting we let them drill here? Vincent's voice rose. Turn the farm into an industrial site? I'm suggesting we explore the option, Judith said calmly. We don't have to lease everything. We could limit it to the sections that aren't actively farmed. The woodlot on the east side, maybe the back pasture we haven't used in years. No, Vincent said flatly. This land has been farmed for 5 generations. We don't just turn it over to gas companies. We don't have to turn over anything, Corinne said slowly, her mind working through the implications. Mineral rights are separate. They'd extract from below the surface. We'd still own the land, still farm it. And if Judith's right about the formation, the royalties could save the farm. At what cost? Vincent stood pacing. Drill rigs on our land? Trucks tearing up the roads? This place becoming something Dad wouldn't recognize? Dad changed this farm dozens of times, Corinne pointed out. He adapted to new technology, new markets, new realities. That's how it survived. That's how any farm survives, by changing. This is different. How? Judith challenged. How is this different from when Dad put in the irrigation system in the 70s? Everyone said he was ruining the land, that you couldn't farm that way. But it saved us during the droughts. How is it different from when our grandfather switched from wheat to corn, and people said he was betraying tradition? Adaptation isn't betrayal, Vincent. It's survival. The three of them sat in tense silence. Finally, Corinne spoke. Let's at least get an assessment. Find out what's actually under the land, what it would involve, what the terms would be. We don't have to decide anything until we have all the information. Vincent looked between his sisters, seeing them united in this, and something shifted in his face. Not agreement, but willingness to consider. All right, we get an assessment, but I'm not promising anything beyond that. The gas company representatives came the following week, serious men in clean clothes who seemed out of place against the farm's working landscape. They explained the process. Seismic surveys to confirm the formation, test wells if the data looked promising, then production wells if gas was found in commercial quantities. The offer was substantial, a signing bonus that would clear the remaining farm debt entirely. Ongoing royalties based on production that could fund equipment upgrades, hired help, expansion. Financial security the farm hadn't known in decades, but it came with trucks and noise and strangers on the land. It came with the reality that the farm would be serving two purposes, agriculture and extraction, and no guarantee those purposes wouldn't conflict. Vincent walked the proposed lease area alone for hours, grappling with what felt like surrender. Corinne found him at sunset, standing at the fence line where their property met the woodlot. I feel like I'm giving up, he said. Like I'm admitting I can't save this place on my own terms. You're not alone, Corinne said. That's the point. And Dad did this too. He leased mineral rights on part of the cabin property to create the trust fund. He adapted. He found a way to save what mattered by being willing to change what didn't. The land matters. The land stays. The farming continues. We just use what's beneath it to secure what's above it. She paused. I rebuilt the cabin using Dad's tools and his techniques, but I also changed things. Made it better, stronger, more suited to how I live. I didn't betray what he built. I honored it by finishing it my way. This is the same thing. Vincent turned to face her. When did you get so wise? When I spent 4 months alone in the mountains, remembering who I was, and then came back here and remembered who we are together. That night, the 3 siblings sat at the kitchen table again, the lease agreement spread before them. They'd negotiated terms that protected the farmland. No surface disturbance in active fields, limited access roads, strict environmental protocols. The gas company had agreed to everything, eager to access the formation their geologists said was one of the richest in the state. If we do this, Vincent said slowly, we're changing what this farm is, forever. We're securing its future, Judith corrected. So it can continue being a farm for another 5 generations. Dad would understand, Corinne said. He left me the cabin knowing I'd change it. He left us the farm knowing we'd have to adapt it. He wasn't protecting the past. He was investing in the future. Vincent picked up the pen, held it for a long moment, then signed his name. Judith signed next. Finally, Corinne added her signature, completing the agreement. It was done. The Alder farm would continue, secured by resources they'd never known they had, saved by a willingness to adapt that had taken 3 siblings and their father's elaborate posthumous plan to achieve. The lawyer would file the papers in the morning. The signing bonus would clear their debt by the end of the month. The farm was saved, not the way any of them had imagined, but saved nonetheless. They sat together in the kitchen late into the night, not celebrating exactly, but acknowledging the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. They'd taken something broken and made it whole, not by restoring it to what it was, but by reimagining what it could be. To Dad, Judith said, raising her coffee cup, who knew we needed each other even when we didn't know it ourselves. To family, Vincent added. Complicated, stubborn, but finally together. To second chances, Corinne finished, and the courage to take them. They touch cups across the table. Three siblings who'd been scattered for decades, now bound by shared work, shared sacrifice, and shared hope for the future. Outside, the farm spread out under stars, its buildings solid, its fields ready for harvest, its future secured by people willing to change everything to save what mattered most.